The first shot rang out across the valley as Faith Donovan stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, hands trembling as she crumpled the telegram announcing her impending marriage to Judge Horace Wilson, a man of 53 years whose wealth had caught her father's desperate attention. At 18, Faith had imagined many futures for herself in the Wyoming Territory of 1876, but none included becoming the fifth wife of the territory's most feared magistrate. The second shot came closer, sending dust kicking up near the water trough, and Faith instinctively ducked behind a wooden pillar. Her father was away in Cheyenne negotiating the final terms of her arranged marriage, leaving her alone with just the aging housekeeper to mind the struggling ranch. The Donovan cattle operation had been failing since her mother's death 3 years prior, and now her father saw only one way out of financial ruin: selling his only daughter to the highest bidder. "Miss Donovan," a man's voice called out, low and urgent, "stay down." Faith peered around the column to see a tall figure sprinting toward the house, rifle in hand. His dark hat flew off as he ran, revealing sun-streaked brown hair that caught the late afternoon light. He vaulted over the porch railing with surprising grace for a man of his height. "Rustlers," he explained breathlessly, pressing his back against the wall beside her. "They've been hitting ranches up and down the valley. I spotted 3 of them trying to cut out some of your cattle near the east pasture. Who are you?" Faith demanded, suddenly aware she was alone with a stranger carrying a Winchester. "Ryker Morgan," he answered, tipping his head in a slight bow while keeping his eyes trained on the horizon. "I signed on with the Campbell outfit last month, been tracking these thieves for 2 weeks." He glanced at her fully then, and Faith felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. His eyes were the color of a summer storm, and despite the dangerous situation, they held a warmth that momentarily made her forget the telegram still clutched in her hand. "Well, Mr. Morgan," she said, straightening her back, "I appreciate the warning, but I can handle myself." She reached through the open door and withdrew her father's shotgun from its place beside the entrance. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Donovan." The third shot split a porch post inches from Faith's shoulder, sending splinters flying. Ryker reacted instantly, pulling her down and shielding her body with his own. For a moment, time seemed to stop as she looked up into his face, feeling the solid warmth of him pressed against her. Then reality crashed back as more gunfire erupted. "We need to get inside," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. They crawled through the doorway and Ryker kicked it shut behind them. Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her face pale with fear. "Get away from the windows," Faith instructed her. The older woman nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. "How many hands do you have working today?" Ryker asked, checking his ammunition. "None," Faith replied bitterly. "Father let most go last month. The last 2 quit yesterday when they weren't paid." Ryker's expression darkened. "Then it's just us." He moved to a window, keeping to the side as he peered out. 3 men, well armed, they're making their way toward the house now. Faith swallowed hard. "The sheriff, 2 days' ride at least." She gripped the shotgun tighter. "Then we fight." Something flickered in Ryker's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or admiration. He nodded once. "We fight." What followed was a tense standoff that lasted until nightfall. The rustlers, realizing the ranch wasn't as defenseless as they'd thought, eventually retreated into the darkness, taking only 2 head of cattle rather than the entire herd they'd planned to steal. As the danger passed, Faith found herself sitting at the kitchen table across from Ryker Morgan, watching him accept a cup of coffee from Mrs. Peterson with a grateful smile. In the lamplight, she could see him clearly for the first time, no more than 25 years old, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard, and those remarkable gray eyes that seemed to take her measure without judgment. "Why were you tracking those men alone?" Faith asked as Mrs. Peterson excused herself to her quarters. "Not by choice," Ryker replied, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "I was riding with 2 other men from the Campbell ranch, but we separated to cover more ground. I'm supposed to meet them tomorrow at Elk Creek." Faith nodded, then noticed him glancing at the telegram that she'd set on the table. She instinctively moved to cover it, but Ryker had already looked away, respecting her privacy. "You're welcome to stay in the bunkhouse tonight, Mr. Morgan," she offered, suddenly not wanting him to leave. "It's the least I can do after you helped save what's left of our herd." "Ryker," he corrected gently, "and thank you. I'd be much obliged." As Faith showed him to the bunkhouse, she found herself talking more than she normally would with a stranger. She told him about the drought that had devastated their ranch, about her mother's death from fever, and about her father's increasingly desperate schemes to save the family land. "He's in Cheyenne now," she said, lighting a lamp in the bunkhouse, "finalizing business arrangements." Ryker seemed to hear what she wasn't saying. "The kind of business that involves you," Faith stiffened, then nodded slowly. "Judge Wilson has offered to clear our debts in exchange for marriage." "Judge Wilson?" Ryker's voice carried an edge she couldn't quite identify. "Horace Wilson." "The man must be 53, Faith finished for him. "Yes, I'm well aware." Ryker fell silent, watching her with those storm cloud eyes. "And you've agreed to this." "What choice do I have?" Faith challenged, her voice breaking slightly. "The bank takes the ranch in 3 weeks otherwise. This land is all I have left of my mother." Ryker stepped closer, close enough that Faith could smell the scent of leather and open prairie on him. "There are always choices, Miss Donovan." "Faith," she whispered. "Faith," he repeated, her name sounding like something precious on his lips. "Get some rest. Things often look different in the morning light." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak again, and hurried back to the main house, wondering why her heart was pounding so fiercely in her chest. Morning arrived with soft golden light filtering through the kitchen windows as Faith prepared breakfast. She'd slept poorly, her dreams filled with Judge Wilson's cold eyes and, strangely, with Ryker Morgan's warm smile. She was beating eggs with more force than necessary when a knock at the back door startled her. Ryker stood there, hat in hand, having already fed and watered his horse. "I thought I might repay your hospitality by checking your fence lines before I head out," he offered. "Those rustlers might have cut them in more places than we know." Faith knew she should politely decline, thank him for his help, and send him on his way. Instead, she found herself saying, "Breakfast first. No one rides out of here hungry." They ate together, Mrs. Peterson joining them with knowing glances between the young people that made Faith blush despite herself. Conversation flowed easily, and Faith discovered Ryker had grown up in Missouri, son of a blacksmith who died in the war. He'd been drifting west ever since, working ranches from Kansas to Wyoming. "And your mother?" Faith asked, pouring him a second cup of coffee. A shadow crossed his face. "Remarried quickly after father died. Her new husband had no use for another man's son." Faith's hand brushed his as she set down the coffee pot. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, his smile returning. "It taught me to make my own way, to recognize what matters in this life." After breakfast, Faith surprised herself again by insisting on riding out with Ryker to check the fences. She told herself it was because she needed to know the condition of her property. But as they rode side by side across the rolling grassland, she admitted, if only to herself, that she simply wasn't ready to watch him disappear from her life. The morning stretched into afternoon as they mended 3 separate breaks in the fence line. Faith worked alongside Ryker, her gloves growing dirty and her face flushed from the exertion. He never once suggested the work was too hard for her, or offered to take over entirely, something that struck her forcefully when she considered how differently Judge Wilson would treat her. "You're staring," Ryker observed as he hammered a fence post back into place, the muscles in his forearms flexing with each strike. Faith quickly looked away. "Just making sure you know what you're doing with my fence," she lied. His laugh was unexpected and warm. "Is that so? And here I thought you might be admiring the view." She felt heat rise to her cheeks but refused to be flustered. "The mountains are indeed lovely this time of year, Mr. Morgan." "That they are, Miss Donovan," he agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. They finished the last repair as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Standing together on a ridge overlooking the valley, Faith felt a sudden, crushing awareness that once they rode back to the ranch house, Ryker would mount up and ride away to meet his fellow ranch hands at Elk Creek. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for this, but for yesterday, too." Ryker turned to face her fully, the setting sun painting his features in gold and shadow. "Faith," he began, then hesitated. She waited, her heart inexplicably racing. "This arrangement with Judge Wilson," he finally said. "Is there no other way?" Faith shook her head. "Father has borrowed against the ranch 3 times over. The judge is the only one willing to settle the debts." "And what does your heart say about marrying him?" The directness of the question took her breath away. No one, not even her father, had asked what she wanted. "My heart doesn't factor into this decision," she answered carefully. Ryker stepped closer. "It should. It always should." Before Faith could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, pushing his horse hard. "That's Timothy Wells, the telegraph operator's son," Faith said, shading her eyes. "Something must be wrong." They mounted quickly and rode to intercept the young man, who was barely 16 and looked terrified to be delivering whatever news he carried. "Miss Donovan," he panted, reining his lathered horse to a stop. "It's your father, miss. There's been an incident in Cheyenne." Faith felt the world tilt beneath her. "Is he hurt?" Timothy twisted his hat in his hands. "He's alive, but they've arrested him for fraud. The bank president claims he forged signatures on loan documents." "That's impossible," Faith protested, but even as the words left her mouth, a sick feeling gathered in her stomach. Her father had grown increasingly desperate in recent months. "There's more," Timothy added reluctantly. "Judge Wilson sent a message too, said under the circumstances he's withdrawing his, offer." Faith sat perfectly still on her horse, feeling oddly detached from her own body. The arrangement with Judge Wilson had been her prison sentence, but it had also been the ranch's only salvation. Now both were gone, and she was free but facing ruin. "Thank you, Timothy," she finally managed. "Please tell your father I'll ride into town tomorrow." As the boy rode away, Faith became aware of Ryker watching her closely. She expected to see pity in his eyes, but instead found only steady concern. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. Faith stared out across her land, the land her mother had loved, the land that would now surely be lost. "I don't know," she admitted, hating the defeat in her own voice. They rode back to the ranch house in silence as darkness fell. Faith moved through the motions of unsaddling her horse and preparing a simple dinner with Mrs. Peterson, who clucked sympathetically at the news of Faith's father. Ryker stayed for the meal, though Faith hardly touched her food. After Mrs. Peterson retired for the evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "I should be relieved," Faith said eventually. "I didn't want to marry him." "But you're not relieved," Ryker observed. "No," she agreed. "Now I'll lose everything anyway, and my father may go to prison." Ryker was quiet for so long that Faith thought he might have nothing to say. Finally, he turned toward her. "I have a proposition for you, Faith Donovan." She raised an eyebrow. "I've had enough propositions lately, thank you." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Not that kind, at least not yet." He took a deep breath. "The Campbell outfit is looking to expand. Mr. Campbell sent me and the others out not just to track rustlers, but to scout neighboring properties he might acquire." Faith stiffened. "If you're here to buy our land at a bargain price—" "No," Ryker interrupted. "I'm here to offer a partnership. Campbell needs more grazing land and experienced hands to manage it. You need capital and workers." He leaned forward. "Keep the ranch in your name. Let Campbell use the eastern section for his herds. He'll pay you a fair percentage and provide men to work both sections. In a few years, you could buy back full control." Faith stared at him. Why would he agree to that rather than just waiting for the bank to foreclose and buying it outright? "Because I'll convince him it's worthwhile," Ryker said with quiet confidence. "And because this land needs you, Faith. Anyone can see how much you love it, how well you understand it." "And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, suddenly suspicious of generosity that seemed too good to be true. His eyes held her steadily. "A reason to stay in this valley." The implication hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly yet both feeling its weight. "I'd need to see terms in writing," Faith said finally, practical despite the fluttering in her chest. "And speak to Mr. Campbell myself," Ryker nodded. "Of course. We can ride to the Campbell ranch tomorrow if you're willing." Faith hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'll be ready at first light." The journey to the Campbell ranch took most of the following day. Faith left Mrs. Peterson with instructions to visit her father in the town jail and assure him she was working on a solution. As they rode, Faith and Ryker talked more freely than before, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, and their disappointments. Faith found herself captivated by Ryker's thoughtful nature and his unexpected sense of humor. He'd seen more of the country than she could imagine, yet spoke of her small valley with genuine appreciation. By the time they reached Campbell's sprawling ranch house, Faith realized with a jolt that she was falling for this cowboy who had ridden into her life just 2 days earlier. Samuel Campbell proved to be a shrewd but fair man in his 50s, with a direct manner that Faith appreciated. He listened to Ryker's proposal with interest, asked Faith pointed questions about the Donovan ranch's water sources and cattle breeding program, and eventually nodded his agreement to the basic framework. "Morgan speaks highly of you, Miss Donovan," Campbell said as they finalized details in his study. "Says you've got more grit and sense than most men he's worked with." His eyes twinkled. High praise coming from him. Faith glanced at Ryker, who looked slightly embarrassed. "He exaggerates," she replied modestly. "I doubt that very much," Campbell countered. "Tell you what, I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. In the meantime, I'll send 4 hands back with you tomorrow to help get things in order. If this arrangement works for 6 months, we'll make it permanent." "And my father's legal troubles," Faith ventured cautiously. Campbell sighed. "I can't promise anything there, but I know people in Cheyenne who might be able to help, especially if the bank's getting its money back." That night, Faith stayed in the Campbell Ranch's guest room, her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in months, she felt hope for her future, a future that might include not just saving her ranch but perhaps something more, something she hardly dared name even to herself. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Ryker standing in the hallway, his tall frame illuminated by a single wall lamp. "I wanted to make sure you're comfortable," he said quietly, "and to apologize if I overstepped by bringing you here." Faith shook her head. "No apology needed. You've given me hope when I had none." Ryker's expression softened. "You gave yourself hope, Faith. I just helped you see what was already there." She stepped closer to him, suddenly bold in the half-darkness. "Why are you doing this, truly?" His hand moved slowly, hesitantly, to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Because from the moment I saw you standing on that porch, shotgun in hand, I knew you were someone worth fighting for." Faith's breath caught in her throat. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," he murmured. "I know you're brave and loyal and stubborn. I know you love that land with everything in you. I know your eyes light up when you talk about your mother's flower garden." His fingers traced the line of her jaw. "And I know I want to see what happens if you're given the chance to live the life you choose, not the one chosen for you." Faith felt tears gathering in her eyes. No one had ever seen her so clearly before. "And what if I choose a life that includes you, Ryker Morgan?" His smile was slow and breathtaking. "Then I'd be the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally parted, Faith felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, as if her world had been rearranged around this new, essential truth of Ryker Morgan. "We should get some rest," he said reluctantly, stepping back. "Tomorrow begins the fight for your ranch." Faith nodded, though rest seemed impossible with her heart pounding as it was. "Good night, Ryker." "Good night, Faith," he replied, his voice carrying a promise that made her shiver pleasantly. The next 6 months passed in a blur of hard work, careful planning, and growing affection. True to his word, Campbell sent men to help at the Donovan ranch, with Ryker appointed as foreman. Under their combined efforts, the ranch began to recover. Faith's father, with Campbell's influence helping to reduce the charges, was released after serving 2 months in jail, returning humbled and grateful for his daughter's determination. Through spring roundup and summer branding, Faith and Ryker worked side by side, their partnership deepening into something neither could deny. They shared long rides checking fence lines, quiet evenings on the porch watching sunsets, and countless stolen moments that made Faith's heart sing. By autumn, when Campbell arrived to review their arrangement, the Donovan ranch was showing a modest profit for the first time in years. The partnership was formalized, with Faith maintaining ownership while sharing grazing rights and profits with Campbell's operation. As they celebrated that evening with a small gathering at the ranch house, Faith found herself standing alone on the porch, watching the first stars appear. Her father had changed during his time in jail, becoming more reflective and less willing to gamble with their future. He had even, to Faith's astonishment, apologized for trying to force her marriage to Judge Wilson. "You seem deep in thought," Ryker's voice came from behind her as he joined her on the porch. Faith smiled. "Good thoughts. I was just realizing how much has changed since that day you came riding in, chasing rustlers." Ryker moved beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Some things haven't changed," he said softly, "like how I feel when I look at you." Faith turned to face him, her heart speeding up as it always did in his presence. "And how is that, like I've found home?" he answered simply. "Not a place, but a person." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small that caught the lamplight from the window. A ring, simple but beautiful, with a small pearl set in silver. "I've been carrying this for weeks," Ryker admitted, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous, waiting for the right moment. He took her hand in his. "Faith Donovan, when I rode onto your land that day, I was just passing through. I never expected to find the one person who would make me want to stay forever." Faith felt tears gathering in her eyes as he continued. "I'm not a wealthy man. I can't offer you the life Judge Wilson might have, but I can offer you my youth, my strength, and my heart completely and forever." He held up the ring. "I love you, Faith. Will you marry me?" Faith felt the tears spill over, running unchecked down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." Ryker slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his joy. Their laughter mingled in the cool evening air as he spun her around. As he set her down, Faith cupped his face in her hands. "You know, when my father first told me about the arrangement with Judge Wilson, I thought my heart would shrivel and die if I went through with it." Ryker covered her hands with his own. "And now I know my heart was just waiting for you," she answered, rising on her toes to kiss him. They were married that December in the small church in town, with Campbell giving the bride away since her father was still too ill from a recent bout of pneumonia to stand for the ceremony. Faith wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Mrs. Peterson's skilled hands, and carried dried wildflowers from the prairie they both loved. As they spoke their vows, Faith looked into Ryker's gray eyes and saw their future stretching before them, challenges and joys, difficult seasons and abundant harvests, children and grandchildren who would grow up loving the land as they did. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ryker kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ranch hands in attendance cleared their throats awkwardly. Faith didn't care. She had found something she never expected when she'd stood on that porch months ago. Telegram in hand, she had found true partnership, deep respect, and a love that asked not for sacrifice but for shared strength. 5 years later, Faith stood on that same porch, watching Ryker teaching their 3-year-old son how to ride his first pony in the yard. Her hand rested on her swollen belly where their second child grew. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, and they had recently been able to buy back the eastern section from Campbell, who was preparing to retire. "Mama, look," her son called, his face alight with excitement as the pony trotted in a small circle, Ryker's hand steady on the lead rope. "I see you, Robert," she called back, her heart so full it felt it might burst. Ryker looked up at her then, his smile as warm and true as it had been the day they met. In that moment, Faith knew with absolute certainty that she had received the greatest blessing a person could hope for, not just to be loved, but to be loved by someone who saw her true self and cherished her for exactly who she was. As the Wyoming sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant golds and pinks, Faith whispered a prayer of thanks for rustlers, for desperate circumstances, and for the young cowboy who had offered his youth and his love when she needed them most.